Be yourself positive. Just another mindset.
Hello, friends, and welcome to a new episode of the Just Another Mindset podcast. We need a paradigm shift if it comes to our economic and social systems. Let us drive this change together. The Just Another Mindset podcast shares inspiration and tangible techniques on how to create seismic shifts in an outdated system, collectively and for individuals alike. My name is Ismail, and each week I bring to you a relevant conversation, message, or theme that will not only entertain you, but help you to change towards a more meaningful and satisfying life. Get encouraged by listening to successful thought leaders, inspiring individuals, and impressive changemakers. Change from within will last and create positive results for all of us. Let us get inspired and embrace collective changes for the better. In today's episode, I share a conversation with you that I had with Erin Remblance. Erin established her early career in blue-chip FMCG companies in Sydney and London, but always sensed there was more important work to be done. Having children gave her the space to explore the environmental and cultural crises on the planet that need to be urgently addressed. She shifted her focus to dedicate her life towards educating people on climate change, degrowth, planetary boundaries, modern monetary theory, and more. Erin is a freelance journalist for Illuminum and lives north of Sydney, Australia, with her family on the occupied Ancestral country of the Gayamagal people. In this episode, we talk about degrowth, societal transformation, and systems change. You will learn about three integral components of a good life and why challenging the old narrative is so important. We discuss countercultures, and you will learn about urgency in this conversation. We discuss new narratives and evaluate citizen assemblies, amongst other first steps towards a more just society. You will understand what social tipping points are after listening to this episode, and you will know what your contribution towards a more collective future can be. We talk about the feasibility of major changes, and you will hear why it is so important to reconnect our leaders with themselves and nature. Wonderful. And with that, Erin, warm welcome to the Just Another Mindset podcast. And my first question for you today is, how do you feel and what is on your mind?
Thank you for having me on the podcast. I feel good. It's sort of crazy busy here with the kids and things, but it's fine. What's on my mind? At the moment, my business is on my mind, the Rebiz. Just working towards the next cohort at the end of March. And I'm just tweaking the syllabus because I think we can include a bit more in it. So my mind is on how I can do that. So that's, super
Wonderful.
Interesting for me. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And I'm sure we're going to talk about Rebiz, we're going to talk about degrowth, we're going to talk about societal transformation. And maybe, Erin, it can make sense to give a little bit of a context. And I suppose that the year of 2019 is a very special and pivotal one for you. And if you may, you could share with us what kind of life you lived before 2019 and why this is such an important year.
Yeah, so my climate activism, so I was becoming more and more aware. I had my first child in 2013 and being home more because I was with her rather than working full time. I had the sort of space and time to start understanding some more of our ecological crisis. So I was aware of some things. I'd watched a few documentaries. I knew the fish were running out. But it wasn't until the IPCC released their report in October 2018. It was a special report into 1.5 degrees of warming. And I didn't read that report, but a friend shared, I think it's a New York Times magazine New York article written by David Wallace Wells, and it was titled "The IPCC says climate genocide is coming." Actually, it's worse than that. And I was reading it, and I was just like, "Oh my goodness!" I had no idea. I had a child, my little baby. She was 5 weeks old, and I was walking up and down the hallway in my house here. She was on me, and I was reading this report, and I was just going, "What? How is this? How is this not being looked after? How is this, I thought someone would be taking care of it." I sort of had that naive illusion that the governments of the world would be doing what was in their best interests. And then so from then on, I decided that actually we should all care about this. And I made a conscious decision not to turn a blind eye to what was going on, even though I'm sure it's often easier just to kind of live your day-to-day life and think, well, someone else will look after that. That's someone else's problem to worry about. So that was 2018. And then I was trying to, it's hard to know, you're kind of treading water for a little while, trying to figure out where you can have an impact. So yeah, I was just trying to share things on my Facebook page with people, and I joined a couple of climate groups, and I went to all the strikes, and I was trying to just do as much as I could that was in my sphere of influence. And then I started writing in 2021. I was reading about degrowth, and I was just thinking, well, one thing I can do is share what I know about degrowth. And I was trying to search for places where I could get that published. And after that began a fairly, productive, positive relationship with a publication called Aluminum. And so I've been writing for them for the last 18 months or so, and just sharing what I'm learning along the way.
Okay, thank you very much. And maybe we can dig a little bit deeper around those topics. For people who are not familiar, we've talked about this on this podcast quite a few times, but how would you define degrowth?
Yeah, so for me, degrowth has two definitions, actually. The first is it's a planned and democratic reduction in energy and material use in wealthy nations, whilst improving the well-being of people in those nations. So it's sort of a recognition that GDP and well-being aren't linked, that GDP isn't really a metric of anything, useful, and that to concentrate solely on that is, probably at the core of our ecological crises, because energy and GDP are basically correlated 1-for-1. So the more GDP goes up, the more energy we're using, which makes it harder to decarbonize, which is why all the renewable energy we've deployed to date is only incremental to the fossil fuels that we're using. Like, there's so much that's all linked in with this. And so we're not trying to reduce our energy use because we're trying to grow GDP. So essentially we're trying to grow our energy use at the same time as decarbonize. And one of the scholars that I follow very closely, Jason Hickel, says it's like trying to run down an escalator that's going up. We're just making the life so much more difficult for ourselves while we're trying to pursue this metric. And well-being in wealthy nations has been decoupled from GDP since the 80s. It's a good long while since it's been positively associated with improving our well-being. Yeah. And so that's the first definition. And the second definition is, and so that's the first definition relates to pure reduction in wealthy nations. But the second definition is if you take the D, which in Latin can also mean away from, not just down, and then you apply it to growth, that means away from growth. And so it's about moving away from growth as anything meaningful and just, trying to achieve objectives. You want to reduce poverty, just reduce poverty. You want to, provide better education, just provide better education. Like, it doesn't need to be about growth all the time. That's not an end in itself. And so it's about, and you can apply it sort of at all levels to ourselves, moving away from growth in our own lives. You can apply it to organizations, you can apply it at the country and sort of the global level. So I think that's an interesting concept as well, this idea. Apparently it's quite historically recent that the future should always be bigger, more than today. And it's related to industrialization and the ability to create more through fossil fuels and that sort of thing. And so, thinking ahead, there's always a bigger house, more cars, or a better car, or, bigger wages, whatever it might be. And so I wonder if we can move our minds away from that and towards actually more meaningful achievements unrelated to material items.
And I suppose that's just the current narrative we have been telling each other for, now we can call it decades, we can call it centuries, but certainly not forever. And I think that definition, or those two definitions, really do help, Erin. And I would be interested, you said you decided to not close your eyes anymore, and you decided to start writing. And by today, you're one of the most recognized experts, let's just call it, on degrowth and on carbon reduction topics online. And I would be very interested how the notion around those topics has changed, if you have a feeling for that. So when you started writing or thinking about it 2019, 2020, and if you compare that to now, 2022, 2023, how are people accepting the discussion about degrowth or about a societal change, if anything comes to mind?
Yeah, I just need to clarify that I'm not an expert. I just feel like I'm an intermediary between the experts and the general public. So I'm learning every day from the experts, and I'm trying to translate that. So hopefully get it to a wider audience, because that's something I can do, but definitely not an expert. I still see a lot of pushback, actually, and maybe surprisingly, I see a lot of pushback in the climate movement. That people think, no, people won't want to hear it. We can't say that. We've got to just, we can solve it with the technology we have, even though we can't. So, but then I see, a lot of traction. So I shouldn't focus on the negatives, but there's a lot of people coming on board and starting to realize that some of the things that are even in the IPCC reports, apparently this conservative body that likes to play, more risk averse than pro risk. They've got some crazy things in their numbers, like technology that doesn't exist is one, or bioenergy, carbon capture and storage is another. Carbon capture and storage is another, which does exist, but has, huge ramifications if applied at the scale they're talking about. So I think that people are starting to realize that actually growing our energy use, i.e. growing our economies, whilst trying to reduce our carbon emissions is crazy, and that there are other alternatives is definitely a sense I'm getting.
And I want to use a quote from an article that you wrote, and it's a fairly recent article from February 2023, and it's called Degrowth, The Path to a Better Life. And in that one, you talk about that from a psychological point of view, the good life, for example, a meaningful and fulfilling life, is built upon three fundamental elements. The first one, the quality of our relationship with ourselves. The second one, the quality of our relationships with others. And the third one, how we relate to the whole of life. And I would love to go through those three fundamental elements with you today and discuss why they are so relevant.
Yeah, so I co-wrote that article with Jennifer Harvey-Selin, and she's a psychologist. So she had a big input into the article, but it's essentially just saying that capitalism has to commodify as much as it can. So through that process, it damages our relationships with ourselves, with our community and others, and with the natural world. And just looking at how stepping away from that sort of system can actually produce greater happiness and greater contentment and ultimately a better life. So I don't think many people would subscribe necessarily to the notion that a good life is what you own anymore. I think maybe that was something that we did think for a long time. I think people are starting to realize what you own, you almost feel empty after a little while. Or I was listening to actually your podcast on degrowth earlier today, And actually you get that new iPhone, and once you've got it, all you want is the next one. Like, you never feel fulfilled. You're always chasing the next thing. You get the new house and all you're thinking about is the next extension or the new furniture, or, you know, it's insatiable. Whereas if you can start to realize, I guess it's the path to contentment, is to be happy with what you have, not always wanting more. And so that article just works through the different elements and how having to work in waged labor, which is, you know, basically all of us these days, may mean that you're having to do a job that you don't find very meaningful just to be able to live, or that you may feel uncomfortable doing things that you may not need to work. You may have other, you know, family arrangements or whatever, but it makes you feel not valued because you're staying at home with your children or you're studying, and you feel like it's perceived as though you're not contributing, because we associate often your pay packet is associated with your worth, I think, sometimes. So that can be troubling for people. Or they may feel like that they can't pursue passions because they're not, when they're commodified, they don't earn enough money. You know, like if you're an artist or something, that becomes difficult to do. And to live well, I guess, to be able to pay the rent and eat well and those sorts of things. So that's the element of your relationship to yourself, and your relationship to others is, there's a couple of elements there. Like, as things become commodified, it becomes more difficult to catch up without there being a financial price tag. So, you know, less, I think, do we go around to people's houses and hang out, and more we go to restaurants and bars and pubs and things. And ultimately that's a choice, I suppose. But there's also the element there of, and I think capitalism sort of thrives on competition, but you start to compare yourself with others and what they might own. And there's the element of envy and how that can ruin relationships, and people constantly comparing what they have versus what other people have. And I think that's really detrimental to forming really strong bonds with people. And the other one is the natural world. So it's really at the heart of the problem that we think that we are separate to the natural world, and that we see the natural world, no, not all of us, obviously, as a resource that can be commodified and turned into something that we can sell to make a profit of. And the more we can reconnect and have a true connection with the natural world, the more at peace we will be. I mean, there's so many studies that say that just spending time in nature is good for our health. And I'm sure if we don't feel like we're responsible for biodiversity loss and, you know, the land use changes that cause deforestation and things like that, we will have a better connection with the natural world.
And I actually do have a few follow-up questions, let's say. And first, you talked about leaving a normal job or leaving a system that for many people, it's not possible, but you, I understand, did take the decision to focus on your activism. And I would be very interested what happened for you personally. Was it very liberating? Was it in the beginning a very difficult step? How did it feel, and what were the steps that you individually felt while going through the process? Because from my personal bubble, let's just call it, the topics that I talk about on the podcast, the topics that I talk about also offline, many people do agree with what also we are talking about today, but many really do struggle to say, okay, where is my starting point? Where do I stop? Okay, I do not want to necessarily feed this system anymore, but they don't really see a way out, if you want to say. So I'm always very interested to understand, how does it feel for you? What happened, and how do you feel about it today?
Yeah, so I was working full time, and then I had my first daughter in 2013, and in 2014 I sort of knew that I wouldn't go back to full-time work until she was a bit older. So I'd stepped away from the full-time corporate role already because I'd found something that was, I guess, more meaningful. I felt like she was a better use of my time than the corporate world. But when I have been working in part-time roles whilst looking after my children. I did move into renewable energy, and it was energy efficiency, and from there I moved into carbon reduction. And they felt good. I felt like I was in the right space. But I ultimately ended up leaving those companies too, because in the end, I felt like they weren't making the changes that we needed to see. And so I felt like I wasn't really doing what I wanted to be doing. So the place that was carbon reduction was about offsetting, and it's just way too late for that. We need to be doing more. And then so I was applying for different things, trying to work in either an activism sort of organization or a policy area. And I found even those places aren't prepared to talk about the true changes that we need to make. It was kind of like, oh no, we can't take degrowth to X whatever group. And it's like, okay, that they are going to need a habitable planet too, right? There was just no courage there to talk about the extent of the changes we need. So it was September last year, and Ra James, who's in the US, approached me about doing this Rebiz course that we've created, workshop. And actually, it's exactly what I want to be doing. I want to be working with people to take them through the full changes that we need, and sharing what I'm learning, and being able to point people in the right direction for where they can find more information, or if there's something of interest to them, I can help them explore that further, and just bring things in front of people that they might not have considered. So that really does tick that box for me. Again, it's still part-time hours because my children aren't all at school yet, but so it's not an easy path, and the issue is that we need to change the system. So it's not something that is going to be open to everyone, really. There's just not a lot of work there that isn't extractive and and growth-based, and there's just not a lot of work that isn't part of the cog of the system. So at the moment I feel like I'm lucky. Maybe this won't last forever, maybe I'll have to do something different, but for now this is where I want to be. So I do feel grateful for that, and I did pursue it actively. As I said, I resigned from companies that weren't aligned. My husband was like, oh my goodness, what more do you want? I was like, I want to do what we need to do. I want to do, I want to actually be genuine and true to what I know needs to be done. So maybe there's a tale in there that if you're really dogmatic about it and you're really not willing to compromise on what you're looking for, something will come through in the end. I'm not sure.
Thank you very much for sharing that. And I would be very interested, because you also talked about consumerism, you talked about individualism somewhat. I'm aware that you also lived in London for some time, but I suppose also in Sydney you can see that. And when you took that decision, you also talked about connecting or reconnecting to others. So I would be very interested if that is also a personal component that took place for yourself. Did you somewhat change something about your social circles, or did you reconnect with new people, with like-minded people? What happened on that dimension, if you want to talk?
Yeah, so 100%, it's made my life so much better to know people who pursue this as well, or it consumes them a little bit too. So I just have a group of 8 friends who are on Signal, and we every day, 12, 15 times a day, someone's throwing something into the group that, maybe the other's unaware of. It's a new article or a tweet or whatever it might be. And I'm so grateful to know those people, because I think if you don't have that network, you can feel really alienated and a bit lost and a bit like you're the only person who cares. So they have definitely helped keep me sane. And when you sometimes feel like you're going crazy because if it was really a problem, someone else would care, it's a nice reminder for me that I'm not going crazy, because there are other people who care, so and want to see the same changes. So if you can just create a network of friends who, and I guess it helps if they're local, just because you can get together, but they don't have to be local. Just find a group of people who care about the same thing, and it will just give you strength and help you through.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important topic or point you raised there. And people listening, they can always reach out to yourself, to myself. I'm just proclaiming that here because sometimes if you start thinking about those topics, as you say, people may feel alienated, right? So you're in this system and you're still part of it. And many of your friends, many of your family, and many of all the people surrounding yourself are still in it. And maybe they haven't opened their eyes or they have not decided to close their eyes. So people can feel lonely fairly fast, I suppose, and can question things. And I think it's very important to have this local or even global community of people whom you can exchange with and whom you can also work towards that change with. I think there are millions of different ways on how to work towards that change, but I think it's also important to do it with other people and not to seek out also, that's a somewhat different discussion, but to save the world by yourself, because I suppose we're not going to save the world by ourselves, but really as this collective and really as this inter-exchanging movement of information and action.
Yeah, so I read that somewhere as something similar as like, how can we save the world? What can we do to save the world? And the first point is don't do it alone. Like find other like-minded people. And because you're right, like I think the risk is that you'll close your eyes again if you don't have other people out there who care. So it started for me with one friend back in 2018. She was the friend who shared the David Wallace Wells article, said we should all care about this. So there was someone I'd worked with like, I don't know, 15 years earlier, and I messaged her out of the blue being like, oh my God. She's like, I know. And just having that person there, from then on, she and I shared articles, and then this circle grew bigger, and now I have lots of friends in the area. But just reach out to people who you think might care too, and make each other stronger.
Erin, when talking about human needs and this current growth paradigm, what we detailed a little bit earlier, you also tend to talk about satisfiers and pseudo satisfiers. And I would be very important to understand what you mean by that and why those two, or the distinction between the two, is so important.
Yeah, this was in the article that I did with Jennifer Harvey-Salin, and this was part of her contribution. So I'll take you through it as best that I know, but I think it's a guy called Max Neef. I may have that wrong, but he's basically saying there's things that can make us happy and there's things that can detract from our happiness. And actually the things that can make us happy tend to be the things that would come about through a degrowth society. So more like community, more connection, more time in nature, more free time to do what we will. So that more autonomy to do the things that we enjoy. And I just think it's a really interesting point that actually the things that we're pursuing right now don't tend to bring us that much happiness. Actually, they can bring us, dissatisfaction, but they don't lead to satisfaction. And it's hard to break through and share that with people because it's not the dominant narrative. We're not led to believe that the new car won't make us happy, or the bigger house won't make us happy, or any of those things. But really just the things we need to make us happy tend to be the really simple things. It's the old adage, like the best things in life are free almost. And it's true to a certain point. There is a certain amount of money we need to be able to meet our needs, our food needs and our shelter needs, and, those sorts of things. But beyond that, it sometimes can just be stuff and not really contribute that much to happiness.
Is that somewhat a learning that each and every individual has to go through him or herself? So, because everybody talks about that, and supposedly since a long time, decades at least, everybody knows that money won't buy you happiness and the new car will not make you happy, and true relationships. And still, many people still seek out to figure that out for themselves. And then some in their 20s, some in their 30s, some in their 50s, some never figure that out. But do you think that this is really part of a personal journey, a personal development somewhat, that people have to figure it out for themselves? Or how come it doesn't work that I tell Erin, you know what, if you buy this Porsche, it will not make you happy, and still you will first try to get there, then figure it out, and then share with the world that it didn't make you
and share your lesson with the world. I just think that there's a dominant narrative that we're fighting. So, and this is Antonio Gramsci's work, who's, I think, late 19th century. I might be wrong. But he called it cultural hegemony. And he was saying that through some of the institutions such as education and media, and I don't know if this is right, but I'd throw in entertainment, we come to take on the ideology of the ruling class. So we tend to think that productivity and economic growth and innovation is really good for us. And, probably things like the new car is what we need to make ourselves happy. And, advertising can be really persuasive. There's a lot of intelligent people that go into creating some of these ads. And so it's hard to throw the shackles of that dominant narrative off. But the solution is to create a counter culture that can then hopefully become stronger. And I think what we haven't got these days that would have existed back in maybe Indigenous times is the wisdom from the elders being shared, the stories they have, what they can share with us about their learnings and their lessons. And they're sharing stories that have been passed down for generations and generations about how to live sort of, I guess, a noble life and a meaningful life. And they make decisions with 7 generations in mind. So they do that. They share these stories down from generation to generation because they want that true sustainability, where we don't tend to have that anymore. So I think that's a challenge. That's why we have to learn these things individually over and over again.
No, and I think what we can learn there is also, if it comes, just to give one example, for decision-making processes, right? So it's not only about the next quarter or the next 4 years, but many societies actually do take into account future generations and the whole ecosystem, not only human beings. And this is really just one example. And you talked about the old narrative and also why the system is somewhat feeding itself. And just a comment there, it also makes sense because for those people or those corporations on top of the old narrative, it's a very lucrative and functioning system, right? It's not just not working for the whole society. And I would be very interested in regard to the new narrative, or what would be concrete steps that you see in order to, change or move towards this societal transformation that we need.
Yeah, so I have an article. It hasn't been published yet, but it might be by the time this podcast is published. And it's titled, "How Does Degrowth Apply to Our Minds?" And it just tackles that entire issue. So what would a counterculture look like? There's so many things that are happening already and really just need to be amplified. So things like, the people who just appreciate the simple life and aren't always seeking more, that is part of a counterculture. They might take jobs as teachers, as nurses, as stay-at-home moms. They might be carers, moms and dads. They might be carers, like whatever it is that they're doing. These aren't the path to high-powered careers with huge financial rewards at the end of them. They're just necessary, socially useful jobs that are counter to the dominant narrative of turning our lives into a biography or a CV where we need to make ourselves saleable for the job market. So that's a counterculture. Just trying to think through my article, what else I had in there. There's, things like, there's different ways of like land ownership, because, the essence of capitalism was enclosure of the commons to keep people off the land they used for subsistence living, basically. So, but now we all think private land ownership is really normal. In fact, in Australia, it's defined as the Great Australian Dream. So it's just thinking about different ways of meeting people's land and housing needs that doesn't require private ownership. That's another aspect of it. There's all, it's the way we relate to time and how we sort of live by the industrial workday. That's all related to this idea of growth and industrialization. So I've just highlighted some different communities that don't live by the 9 to 5. They just live how they want to live, and they don't worry about the time on the clock. So it's just basically, highlighting people whose lifestyles are harmful is against the dominant narrative. So we sort of have this idea that hard work is really virtuous, and if you work hard, you're entitled to anything that hard-earned money can buy. Whereas the people what's the word? The people who are highlighting how private jets are harmful, and who are promoting flight-free lifestyles, these are all counter-culture narratives that we can join forces on and amplify and start to challenge that dominant narrative.
Erin, you talked about some kind of counter culture, and I would like to use another quote from another article when we talk about change and its difficulties on an individual but also on a collective level, and it's about urgency. And in your article, we are still not taking climate change seriously from November 2022. You're talking about collective actions during World War II and also during COVID-19, and you're writing the following. With the response to these emergency situations in mind, and at the conclusion of COP27, it is particularly disheartening to see that leaders still are not taking climate change, the greatest threat humanity has ever faced, seriously. This has been the case for decades and will continue to be the case until leaders make commitments and implement them. To reduce fossil fuel use effective immediately with binding annual targets and in a fair, just, and scientifically informed way until we reach zero emissions roughly by the middle of next decade. So now if we talk about this counterculture, I would be very interested, what do you understand the importance of collective and courageous acts of leadership to be?
Yeah, I think there's such a lack of leadership at the moment, like at the level of political leaders. So that piece there that you just read out is, I think there was probably some quotation marks in there, but it's following the work of Jason Hickel. He wrote an article after COP26, and some of those ideas were pulled into this article. And in his article in November 2021, he was talking about signing the non-fossil fuel proliferation treaty. And once every government in the world signs that, then they can feel confident that no one's missing out. No one's going to grow their economy at the expense of someone else, and we can start to actually wind fossil fuels down. But in terms of leadership, there is no political leader in the world at the moment who is being honest with their citizenship about what we need to do. Like, there's just no one talking about it. There's some political parties in Spain. That's not true. There's the president of Bolivia is very clear about what we need to do. Sorry. So that was a really Western perspective. Actually, there's lots of leaders in the global South who are being honest, but they're not in a position to do what needs to be done. So the countries causing the harm are the overdeveloped nations in the West, and they're the ones who need to reduce their emissions first and foremost. In fact, I think it's fairly well agreed that the global South should have space to increase their emissions, to increase their standards of living, and sort of catch up a little bit. So of the leaders who need to be doing the most, none of them are being honest about the work that needs to be done. And it's a big frustration of mine, because a lot of the climate work is sort of ignoring that fact and just talking about we're talking about like hitting targets and things, but we're not talking about the changes we need to get there. And a sort of it's a difficult topic, so let's not raise it, or we might lose a few people, so let's not raise it. Everyone believes in growing the economy. That's a good thing. GDP is the metric we use, but there's no time to change it. But there's just no mathematical way to get to where we need to go while we're not prepared to have these conversations. So there's a huge lack of leadership. And there's, glimpses of it. There's members of the Greens Party in the UK who get up and openly talk about GDP being a junk metric. there is glimpses of it, but at the people with the power to make the right decisions, they're not there yet. And then if people talk about how political leaders can only move at the pace of their constituents, and maybe that's just a cop out, because actually people look up to these leaders to help inform their decisions too. So when COVID came, when they made the tough calls, they made the decisions that may have been unpopular but were necessary for various reasons. So they can show leadership. I think it's as an easy way out to say that it's difficult, and they can't do it until their electorate allows them to.
One thing that comes to mind, I just recently had a conversation with Tim Jackson on this very podcast, and what turned out to be his first book on degrowth when he wrote, but it was actually a government report in 2009. And when he first put it together, he wrote it for the government as kind of an economic recommendation. And he handed it in, and he was like, it was all based on scientific evidence. And he was like, okay, that's interesting, and that may change something. And what he saw is a whole lot of nothing, a whole lot of silence. People were just not ready. And he actually argued that it has changed over the past almost 15 years. So there are some good signs. But this basically outlines or goes with what you say, like the global north leaders, let's just call it, are basically also stuck in a system which doesn't allow them to talk to such topics, right? Because you're only re-elected if, and you have to make sure that your corporation is making profit off. I mean, this is in the law. The binding regulation of a corporation is to make profit for its shareholders and nothing else.
100%,
and
yeah.
I would be very interested to understand or to look at a way forward. So I think we understand the why the leadership is such an important component. So how can we create spaces, or how can we create awareness that leaders can then use in order to take more, let's call them more educated or more good decisions towards a more collective future for all of us, let's say?
Yeah, just going back to Tim Jackson and his prosperity without growth, I can understand his frustration. But it was the Club of Rome who released their Limits to Growth report in 1972, and that was 50 years ago, and nothing's changed since then either. So, these problems have been around for a long time, and people have been turning a blind eye to them for a very long time too. But it's positive, as you say, that he thinks things are changing, possibly because we're hitting the limits of growth, in the next decade or so. I've got a very Australian specific slant on things because I'm more familiar with our political atmosphere, but it probably applies everywhere or to many places. And actually, I'll pull out a French example because it's useful, and a UK one. They have citizens' assemblies there. And when you provide the citizens' assemblies, so, Joe Public, sort of elected because they are a fair representation of society, they make recommendations that are aligned with degrowth policies. So they're filled in our ecological crises, and then they're asked to provide some recommendations of what we can do to avert disaster. And in very many instances, they choose the path that's degrowth aligned. So, it might be a carbon tax, or increasing the cost of flights versus rail so that people choose the low carbon alternative, or, implementing 15-minute cities, or, turning the verge of gardens into fruit forests. Like, there's plenty of examples of that, where everyday people, when given full information, choose an ecologically sound alternative. So in Australia, I think there's a lot of donations from fossil fuel corporations, and not even just fossil fuels. Like, lots of corporations will struggle if we were to implement degrowth. There's lots of sectors that would be wound down. And so in many instances, they're making decisions that are aligned with their donors and not the citizens of the country they're meant to serve. So the pathway here, and there's something that there are lots of people working on, is to get donations out of politics so that they can start to actually represent the people that they're meant to represent. So that's sort of one lever we can pull. And then I think it's just a cultural movement. Like there's a degrowth scholar in Melbourne, his name's Samuel Alexander, and I think his view is probably widely held, but he's the one I've been reading. And he says we won't get a politics of sufficiency until we get a culture of sufficiency. So it's just trying to get people to want to, buy less, who want to shop locally and have that community atmosphere and share between each other, and who think that flying is something we do rarely, and if we can avoid it we do. That sort of culture will feed through to our politics eventually.
And I suppose that this is why the work that you are doing is so important, to somewhat educate and also unite people and make people aware that there are many, many people out there who have similar thoughts, beliefs, and values. And it's really not you and yourself in your isolated area. And we talked about social tipping points, and I would be very interested what you understand those to be, because I suppose this goes in line with what you just discussed, that we as humanity, we as societies, we as citizens do in fact have the power to change something. And I think it's also a very important distinction that we are in fact the ones who will change something. Yes, leadership is important, and yes, we need to get the people with the right minds into leadership, the leaders of tomorrow somewhat. And yes, we do need to create spaces for leaders in today's world, but the society, citizens in democratic, but also in other societies, play a huge role. So if you want to talk to those social tipping points, I would be very interested.
Yeah, so the research says that if you get 25% of people behind a cause, it then very quickly tips over and becomes sort of the dominant belief in society. So that research uses the way that smoking became really unpopular fairly quickly. So it took a little while, it's a few decades there, and then once it became unpopular, it just really tipped, and you don't see people smoking on airlines or in offices or in cars with children or in houses with children anymore. It just became something that you didn't do in restaurants or in nightclubs and that sort of thing. So there is, actual real life examples of when it's happened. And so I always find that really positive. Like we don't need to get everyone on board. Sometimes people ask me, how do I get, my uncle, who politically conservative uncle on board? It's like, don't, leave him. He's not the people you need to. He's not going to be the easiest nor the most likely to come on board. Get the people who are and build a movement. And once we get the numbers, it will just it'll snowball. It'll take on a life of its own. So get the low-hanging fruit. Don't bend over backwards trying to get the people who just aren't going to come on board. Like we won't reach everyone. Like we just won't. That's not possible. But there's plenty of people we will reach who want to hear the truth. And I liken it. I used to work for this guy who used to say I gave him brain ache. Like if I ever delivered bad news, it's like, oh, you give me brain ache again. And I think we can do that to people, but I don't think it's a reason to not do it. Like be that annoying person who talks about the uncomfortable things, because you are planting a seed that will grow in time, and people will be curious and they'll learn more. And, I've had lots of people thank me for making them aware of whatever it might be, even though at the time I didn't want to do it, like, oh, like here I am going again with the same old stuff. But actually there are people listening and watching and taking on board and changing, which is the most important thing. That's why they say the most important thing you can do is to talk about it. If it becomes this thing that no one talks about, then no one thinks anyone cares or is doing anything about it. But the more people who talk about it, the less alone people will feel, the more normal it seems. You won't feel like such an outlier. You'll actually feel like you're part of a movement. So, if that's all you do, if you don't even change your electricity provider or whatever, start talking about it.
No, I totally do agree that talking about it, creates an atmosphere that people may or may not question their own ways of living. And it also connects you, which goes back to those collective groups of people, to other people who are talking about those topics that are dear to you and that are dear to the world, I suppose. And I had a few more things and that I would like to hear your thoughts on. And the first one could be the 4-day week. Another one could be a minimum basic income. Another thought could be universal services. I don't know if we want to choose either of them or go through all three of them. What your thoughts on those are, because I think they also link with this counterculture or with this new narrative. So I would be very interested in what you think about them.
Yeah, thanks for raising those. When I was struggling to remember what I wrote about in my article, all of those were part of it. But they're all tenets of degrowth. So if we're going to reduce material and energy throughput in wealthy nations, that ultimately means reducing production and consumption. So if we don't need to produce as much nor consume as much, we don't need to work as much. So particularly if we're closing down big industries, you know, like there is no carbon free way of flying at the moment, and that's after decades of trying. I think Richard Branson invested, you know, I think it was $300 million or pounds, dollars, whatever, a lot, into trying to find a carbon neutral way to fly. So, you know, the aviation industry will have to shrink over the next coming decades. You know, single-use plastic, huge automobiles, new house builds, you know, there's lots of parts of our economy that really, if we were trying to do the ecologically sound thing for future generations, and even ourselves, this will happen in our lifetimes. I think democratically we decide that they're not worth pursuing. So when you start to shrink these industries, you're taking away jobs. And one way to manage that across the broad sector of society is to reduce the work week to 4 days, so you can share the remaining jobs around. So it's not necessarily about doing the same amount of work in 4 days, which is what some studies have been. It's about doing 4 days work in 4 days, leaving that 5th day to someone else to have a job to do. So that's the premise behind a 4-day work week. And who wouldn't love a 4-day work week? Like, that's a huge selling point for climate, for someone pushing climate action. Universal basic income. So that's different to, no, sorry, there's another option, which is a basic minimum income. So anyone who didn't want to work would still be provided with a basic minimum income so that they could survive. They're, you know, for whatever reason, they're injured, they're, you know, close to retirement, whatever, there's still that safety net for people to receive a basic minimum income. A universal basic income and a living wage is another idea that's out there. So that, and it's, you know, there's some really cool aspects. Like if you're an artist who would struggle to survive on the revenue that you'd produce, then you could live on a universal basic income and still do what you love doing. That's really socially beneficial. You know, that applies to lots of things. If you're a carer, if you're a stay-at-home mom, if you're retraining because your industry's been shut down and you want to go into a new area, a universal basic income is such an amazing safety net. It just means that everyone can eat and put a roof over their head, and not fall through the cracks like we have at the moment. Another thing that is proposed under a degrowth scenario is a federal jobs guarantee, so a federally funded jobs guarantee, which would provide anyone who wanted to work with work, and they would say that the work would be determined at the community level. So you could say, you know, I live near the beach, I want to teach kids how to swim and I want that to be my job, and they go, cool, you do that. And that is an amazing prospect, because then your unemployment level becomes zero. Like, there's literally no unemployment. There's the opportunity for anyone who wants work to work and to be paid for it. And then it starts to make it look like such a cruel system that we live under, that we have unemployment levels of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7%, you know, hundreds, millions of people who can't find work, who want work, when actually we could do away with it pretty easily if that was the political choice that was made.
I suppose quite a few people would jump now and say those are all nice ideas, but it's not really feasible. How would you counter that?
So some of these ideas belong to modern monetary theory. So modern monetary theory says that governments of currency issuing nations aren't like households and don't need to balance the books. So if you issue a currency, you can create as much of that currency as needed. And then everyone goes, but what about inflation? And so under MMT, you go as needed, provided that you're managing the inflation. So you're not just throwing money out there, but the problem isn't a shortage of money. The problem is a shortage, or it's the way you utilize the real resources of an economy. So when you start to put more money out there, then you have resources to put that money to use. So like if you're fully stretched, you're at capacity in construction, there's not a scope to add a new stadium build, whatever. That's just putting money out there that won't get soaked up. So it's about your actual genuine real resource constraints, not about your monetary constraints. And so there's the money there to do whatever we'd like to do with it, provided we're managing the real resources. So if we wanted to pay people to save children or teach children how to learn just to be in the ocean safely, the money's there. It's just a choice that we're not currently making. There's an amazing article by Jason Hickel on it. I can provide you with a link to add to the show notes if you'd like, about the ways that MMT could help facilitate a degrowth economy.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll definitely make sure to link that. And when we talk about different measures, one that I have been actively talking about with friends and with acquaintances lately, I don't know how the, let's call it, societal narrative in Australia is, and it would be very interesting. But in Europe, it's also a lot about getting old and not having enough money once you're old, once it goes into the pension. And one idea I came across, if we talk about basic income, is that you don't necessarily get this basic income from the point that you're 18 or 20, but that you make sure that each and everybody gets it whenever they are 40 or 50. And this could even fuel innovation. So for the first, let's say 10 or 20 years of your career, you can try out different things and you can figure out if you come up with an innovative idea, because you have this clarity, you have this security that once you're 50, you're not going to be by yourself and you're not going to be poor. So I don't know if you came across that idea before or what you think of it.
I haven't come across that idea, but even earlier today, I was just saying superannuation, which is what we call like a private pension here, such a bad idea, okay? Because it relies on a growth economy. So we're all relying on compounding growth so that our super pension can increase, so that we've got money to feed ourselves and keep warm in old age. And it's so cruel that we're all reliant on this basically capitalist system to look after ourselves, when under modern monetary theory, currency issuers have whatever money they need and could provide everyone with a livable pension in old age. In fact, that's how we used to do it before we decided that we should all have pensions. So for anyone who wants to learn more about modern monetary theory, Stephanie Kelton has written a book called The Deficit Myth, and it's really worth a read to start to go, oh yeah, like that makes sense. Like it never made sense to me that we'd say we're leaving this debt for our children to pay back, like why, like I know it always made sense to me that a currency issuing nation could always pay off its debt really quickly. But the flip side of that is that, so a government deficit is money that they've put out into the private sector. So it's money that are in mum and dad bank accounts and in businesses and whatever. So when they start to rein that in, it's money they're taking away from mum and dads and private businesses and things like that. So where we go, yeah, government surplus, it's like, no, that's taking money out of your bank accounts. Like that is actually, crippling the economy from that point of view. So it's just a different way of looking at the economy than what is the dominant narrative. So I guess that's a good counterculture thing to try and amplify as well.
Another bullet that I wrote down for myself is the topic of donations. We talked about it in the political realm a little bit, but I suppose there are also many people who work their old paradigm job, let's just call it, and once a year they donate a lump sum somewhere. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but when we talk about monetary systems, this is also like an interesting topic to discuss, I suppose, and I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a policy failure that we have these charities that exist, I just feel like if we wanted to support cancer research, we could do it. If we wanted to make sure that children had what they need to go to school, we could do it. Like, and I find it really confronting that there's people standing in front of the supermarket begging me to give them money when we could solve all this, at the government level if we wanted to. Maybe people just aren't voting the right way. Maybe the dominant narrative, people don't realize that these could all be solved in a heartbeat. And actually, I don't know if you've read Jason Hickel's book, The Divide, but I think it's an Oscar Wilde quote through the book. You might recall it if you've read it, where he just says, donations or charity is masking the problem. It's creating a band-aid that makes it seem like the system isn't causing the harm that it is causing, and therefore it's stopping that being exposed and the solutions to the systemic problems being addressed. And I read that and I was like, oh, like I've got all these direct debits that go out every month trying to, help children get their eyesight fixed or help a child in Indonesia, like heaps of them. I was like, oh, I'm part of the problem. I think donations are a sign of a systemic issue, and charities.
Thank you very much. And yeah, we talked about leaders and leadership and political leaders again. And I would like to allow some time to talk about reconnecting business leaders back to earth. And you talked a little bit about it earlier, the Read Biz. And you recently co-founded Rebiz, which is an online workshop and emergent creation lab designed for business leaders who want to redefine business as usual. And you talked a little bit about the goal of Rebiz already. And I would like to understand, Erin, what is the approach of Rebiz in order to reach the goals?
Yeah, so it's something that I'm really proud of, and it's 100% not just my work, it's Ra James's work as well. And we sort of have these complementary brains, as I like to call it. So he's very much involved in the ancient wisdoms and the kinship worldview, and how we as individuals see the world. And I love it. And he's bang on. And then I'm like, great. And now I want to know how we apply that to the organizations we participate and the systems that we're a part of, so that we have this full spectrum. So it's like this really solid, regenerative, kinship, ancient wisdom, post-growth, degrowth, sustainability course that goes full spectrum from individuals, worldview, grief, empathy, all of these really important aspects to organizations, and what areas those organizations play in, what the governance structure is, how they're founded, what the key aspects of those organizations are, and how they can fit into a degrowth or post-growth model, if they're regenerative type businesses, all the way to the changes we need to see in society, and some of the things we talked about just now under a degrowth society, the 4-day work week, and which industries need to be wound down. So it goes full spectrum from you and how you think to how the world should operate, and everything in between. So there's a lot of content. We've just run the first cohort, and I think people did find it a lot, but also they wouldn't have had it different. So it's sort of like, it's a big lot of information taken over a 4-week period, and that's just how it is. And I think some of it will be absorbed at the time of reading, and some of it will just gently place in the back of your mind somewhere, and it'll just slowly grow, and you'll realize that that's had an impact on you a little while later. Speaking from my own experience of how I've encountered these sorts of ideas. But I think it's been really well received so far. We're just running our second one on the 27th of March. But I was really happy with how people found it and the impact it had on them. And it's just a real joy to be able to share some of this stuff with people. And it's not all easy stuff. Some of it's quite confronting. But it's all really necessary and important. Yeah.
No, I totally do agree. And I want to acknowledge the two of you, and really all of you who takes part in such developing, self-developing, collective developing initiatives. So very much thank you for that. And you actually talk about 6 program deep dives, and I would like to make that a little bit explicit. So maybe you can just like 1 or 2 sentences, what is behind that line that I'm going to read out, that you tell us a little bit what you mean with that. And the first one is realizing our ecological status.
Yeah, so anyone who's taking this course is probably pretty acutely aware of where we are versus the planetary boundaries and what we need to hit if we're to stay within 1.5 degrees of warming and that sort of thing. But I wanted to make sure we're all on the same page. And I also didn't want to just go in and assume that everyone knew and almost not cover it. So it's a basic, 101 of where we are ecologically, with some of the hard-hitting truths like the tipping points and the planetary boundaries that we're crossing and some of those things. And it's a really important lead into the next point. I'll let you say your next point because I think then I can follow on.
The second one was reuniting with grief as a tool.
Yeah. So from there, we talk about grief, and we just talk about how if you really absorb that first section, it should have an impact on you. Like, you not just sort of intellectually absorb it, but really emotionally absorb what it means and what it means for the future. Like, that should put tears in your eyes ultimately, and to allow people to feel like that. And I think it's really important, because unless it's sort of almost denial if you're haven't gone through that stage of facing into it. And rather than, I think lots of people won't let themselves grieve over the state of the world, because it's like, well, where does it stop and what good will it do? But actually, the people who I know that are most active are the people who use that grief and turn it into action. Yeah. So, and like, there's a story that I probably shouldn't share, but I do in the groups, about how I was sort of, wet-faced and probably snotty-nosed in front of one of my bosses at one of the, the more ecologically sound organizations I was working for, but frustrated because they weren't doing enough, and thinking about all the people who are going to suffer when the glaciers melt and there's no water, and, there's, the flash flooding, all of it. Like, it's just so horrific. And, there's an experience where, are you familiar with George Monbiot? He's a Guardian writer in the UK. He's an environmental journalist. He does some great pieces, and he was interviewed on like Good Morning Britain or something, and he was just crying. He's just going, we are talking about everything you love and everything you hate. Like, we're talking about losing all of it. And he was just, sort of in tears on the TV show. But he says, that's what makes him such a good journalist, because he's able to face into it and to be honest with himself and then turn that into action. So rather than being scared of grief, I think it's empowering, actually,
to invite it. No, I think that makes perfect sense. And I think that also links to the next one, the third one, which is restorative justice and trust.
Yeah, so this is Ra takes the lead on this one, and Ra's done a lot of travel. So he has some amazing experiences, and he just brings a wonderful perspective to the workshop. And he'll talk through stories that he's heard or what he's experienced of people who show so much more empathy and I'm not quite sure the right word, but they we've got quite a harsh justice system in most of the Western world. It's about jail time and incarceration and things like that. And he'll share an example from an Indigenous family where their son was murdered, and they not only stayed connected with the person who killed their son, but they invited him into their family because that was the way to heal as a community, because not bringing that son in, the person who caused the harm into their family would have done more damage to their community overall. So, things that we think are unthinkable actually more powerful and probably more healing and creates more harmony than what we think of as normal and right. just different worldviews. It's amazing to think about different ways we can do things.
On those worldviews, I could imagine you're also gonna challenge in the fourth one, which is reversal thought experiments.
Yeah, so this is the trickster sort of archetype where things that we're told are good and right often aren't. So, like underdeveloped nations just need help a little bit. And it's like, well, actually, the reversal thought experiment is, what if underdeveloped nations can't develop because they're giving us their labor and their natural resources? It's just like flipping things on the head and just seeing, actually, maybe there's another way to look at this. Maybe I'm not being told the full story here. And usually there's a good reason, and maybe not the right reason, but why you're not being fed the true story. So it's just, we look at it in lots of different lights, like I need the latest phone to feel good about myself. It's like, well, actually, maybe the phone is part of the reason why I don't feel good about myself. And maybe the new phone's not going to solve it. Actually, it's going to make it worse. Just like even in our own lives, we can have that sort of trickster view and challenge our thinking to see if there's another way of looking at things that's actually probably healthier and more correct.
Somewhat creating those new narratives and particular stories around such and hypothesizing. I think that makes very good sense. And the fifth one is reclaiming our gift as humanity.
Yeah, so I think along the way we've just been we've absorbed the dominant culture and we've forgotten what it is to be human. So and this one really is about reconnecting back with the earth and realizing that, literally we could lose our arm or our leg and be alive. But we couldn't live without water, and we couldn't live without air, and we can't live without trees, and we can't live without, a stable climate. So it's just realizing that we are all interconnected. And it's really interesting, like this concept of an individual. Like, is there even such a thing? Like, we've all got, bugs and bacteria and things that live on our skin and even in our eyelashes. And there's literally trillions of bugs in our gut to keep us healthy. Like, there's nothing individual about us as a physical body, and there's nothing individual about us. We couldn't exist on our own without the services. That's a bit of a mechanical way to look at it, but the things we get from nature. And so it's about realizing that we are a part of nature and not separate too.
No, absolutely. That we are in fact nature. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's one big ecosystem. No, I totally do agree. And the last one or chapter is redesigning systems with life. I like that one.
Yeah, so that's about applying degrowth into our organization so that we can get back within the planetary boundaries and therefore, try and avoid a mass extinction event. Just offhanded. And so it's about what kind of organization. So we're not talking about dismantling markets and trade, right? They've existed for thousands of years and will continue to exist. But what we are talking about is sort of dismantling those systems that create, vast inequality and are causing lots of harm ecologically, lots of pollution, deforestation, the whole thing, ocean acidification. So it's more about what would those structures look like that have people and planet at the heart of them and not profit and growth. And so we just work through what they would look like. What does it look like to meet human needs but not human wants? Which sectors would you play in? Because if you're trying to make an organization resilient, you probably don't want to play in the wants. You probably want to be closer to the needs so that, as things become tougher, your organization will still exist. And because that makes your community resilient too. Like, if you're growing food and sharing it locally, that's really amazing, because if there's going to be food shortages, you will set your community up better than if you haven't established some of those things. Yeah.
No, absolutely. Thank you very much for that detailed perspective on the rebus. And again, I want to acknowledge you for your work there and for all your work, really. Erin, I have a couple of questions that I ask each and every of my podcast guests. But Before we go there, is there a particular example or a topic or a theme that you deem we have not discussed in detail today and that you would like to share with our audience?
No, I don't think so. I think so on the topic of my latest article, so we've covered that off, and then we've talked about rebiz, which is also on my mind. So no, I think we're good.
Wonderful. So I have 3 last and final questions for today's podcast episode. And Erin, the first one is, what is it that makes you hopeful?
I don't really like hope. I'm not a hope person. I try not to think in terms of hope. So, because I don't really want my actions to be determined or to be, I guess, dictated or determined by whether I'm feeling hopeful or not. So I don't want to wake up and not feel hopeful, so then I don't do anything, and then something happens, and now I feel hopeful. So now I'm willing to be more active. I just think that we need to do the job, and I don't think. Oh, this is going to sound a little bit harsh, but I think it's a little bit indulgent to wallow in whether we feel hopeful or not. So I just try and just keep on moving. I think it's better to do something than not do something, even whether you're hopeful or not hopeful. So I just keep moving. Yeah.
No, certainly a perspective. Thank you very much for sharing that. The second one is, who are your mentors, or whom do you look up to personally?
Jason Hickel. He's not my mentor, though. I've never met him. But I certainly reference his work like every day. I just follow all the degrowth scholars. So Timotei Parikh, Georgos Kallis, Samuel Alexander, Julia Steinberger. Yeah, they're probably the key ones. And I just learn so much from them and just follow their work. Yeah, but I don't have a mentor day to day. That would be really cool, I think. It'd be nice to have someone you could just chat to and help. Yeah, maybe I need to find myself a mentor.
Wonderful. And with that, Erin, the last and final question of today's episode, and it's a rather hypothetical question, and I call it the 3 truths. And I would like you to imagine that you're traveling in space and all by yourself, and actually for quite some time, for a couple of months or even a couple of years. And after all that traveling, you encounter a human-like species, and they can only process 3 facts or 3 truths about humanity before they decide whether or not they want to get to know us. What is it that you tell them?
Ooh, good question. I think that they should know that we are inherently cooperative. I think it was David Graeber. He's I think he's an anthropologist, and he said we're all socialists in our private lives. You know, like we all look after each other, and you know, babysit each other's kids, or you know, whatever we do, help each other move, or whatever. So I think we're inherently cooperative. We are tribal, like we are social beings, and we like to live with others. And we fear, and it goes back to sort of the tribal days, but we fear being excluded from the tribe as well. So I think that's really like a key part of our social makeup, is that it's still, because of the tribal days, I think it still physically hurts when you feel excluded. So you see it in kids, but actually when you see it in kids, it's because it hurts you as an adult still. It goes through your brain. So we're cooperative, we're social. And I guess that I think there's just a vast array of different ways to be human. Like, I just don't think there's this one way of being human. And I love thinking about all the different cultures that have come from, you know, several thousands of years, and they're so different around the world. And maybe for the latest generation, like the world, it's been a little bit westernized, but there are so many different ways to live and to be with with each other, and so many different traditions. And I just think it's a really beautiful tapestry of different ways we could live. So there's sort of, we are social and we are cooperative, but we're all different as well. And that's sort of the uniqueness and the beauty of it all. And that's the really, amazing part of humanity.
No, very much like that. Diversity, the social aspect, and that we are, in fact, cooperating with each other. And with that, Erin, thank you so much for being a guest on the Just Another Mindset podcast. And if you have any last and final comments for our audience, it's all yours.
No, it's just a pleasure being on, and I just want to encourage everyone to use their voice and whatever abilities they might have to try and be the change that they want to see.
Wonderful. Finishing up with Gandhi, be the change in the world you want to
That's
see.
right.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Thank you, Erin.
My pleasure. You're welcome.
If you enjoyed this podcast and learned from it, please feel free to share this episode with a friend or two, and make sure to subscribe to the Just Another Mindset podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please use the next 10 seconds to give the Just Another Mindset podcast a rating, and know that you will help me to create more meaningful content like this, and also that it will help other people to find this content and get inspired as well. If there is any future topic or guest that you would like to hear more about on the Just Another Mindset podcast, please let me know by leaving a comment on YouTube or sending a mail directly to contact@ishmaelwondergarten.com. And if nobody told you lately, be reminded that you are worthy, you matter, and you can achieve anything.
Be yourself positive. Just another mindset.